and welcome back to the Digital Electronic World Point Report. This is your hostess, Margarita. Today, with the close of Women's History Month, I remind you that when I spoke briefly about the importance of Women's History Month on International Women's Day with my comment, I broached the subject of how we should think of different references and the importance of contributions that women have made to history and historical moments throughout the facets of history. And for the moment and to begin, I thought I would quote a woman who has found herself journaling about gardening, Maribel Osler, from a journal of hers, 1986. Briefly, she writes, "It is possible to garden and to travel. Or are the two things contradictions in terms? If you talk to gardeners, they always seem to be waiting, expecting and hoping, watching in anguish or jubilation, forever urged on with greater ambitions. Can gardeners be otherwise? Can there be a kind of half-gardening? Or must commitment be total? If gardening is the essence of continuation of one thing flowing into another, a procession of followers that must be compounded of color, habit, and form, then where does that leave travel?" Now, I'll pause there because her journal does continue into quite depth about why it's so important for gardeners to continue to travel, because the seasons never do end. One season flows into another, and really a garden does require a lot of tending and attention to. And I did want to also specify the importance of why really gardeners are attentive to so much detail in a garden, but just as attentive to the fact that there's so much diversity in a garden, and gardens, actually, different flowers, different trees, different shrubbery, are from many parts of the world. And it speaks to the fact that when we draw our attention to not only the different, whether it's a perennial or an annual, we can really look at our own experiences and how diverse we are as people. But we don't get to understand that unless we ourselves travel. And so I got to thinking, myself, where was I 20 years ago? 20 years ago in March, I was in Singapore for a week. And it was quite a wonderful experience because speaking of gardening, I understood how beautiful a country such as Singapore is, because things such as orchids grow outside in the open because of the climate. And the temperatures are just so different than where I grew up. And it was such a blessing to be able to experience the culture, not only from the food, but the people and the, as I said, the naturescape. But speaking of, as I mentioned, gardening, the fact that the flora were so different, yet so similar, because here, where I grew up, I might have a tough time finding the types of flowers that there were growing naturally outside. And so that's one example of what is similar to what Ms. Osler is talking about here in her journal from 1986. So that is something that I wanted to just dovetail back to something very similar. Now, having said that, additionally, I wanted to bring something back to Women's History Month. I was doing a little spring cleaning, and I found something quite splendid that really was a throwback. Not throwback as in throw it away, but throwback as in what a wonderful example of women's history. Because here was a newsletter that I have that has been in one of my files of paperwork from many experiences that I've had from March of 2003, Women's History Month. It's talking about, here it is, it's advertising. March is Women's History Month. Oh, well, this is wonderful. And it's giving an example of the speaker that was going to be speaking for Women's History Month, a person who was the curator of a museum at the time. And her name, I wanted to call her attention for this particular month, is Midge Costanza, who happened to have been the first woman presidential advisor to Jimmy Carter, assistant to Governor Davis in 2003, also 20 years ago. And so then I got to thinking, oh my goodness, what is happening? That's so many years ago. Where was I 30 years ago? Well, 30 years ago, I was taking a little bit of time off from the university where I was attending, and I was having surgery because I had broken some hardware that I had installed. Sometimes humans have surgeries, and these pieces of hardware, I mean, we go to the hardware store to actually repair our houses, but sometimes we have some of these put into our bodies. Not always, but some of these had broken, because you could see they're different sizes. And this one had been removed and pieces ended up still staying inside. But I did ask to keep them. That's why I still have them, because interesting that way. And so I had them removed, and you're probably wondering, well, how did she just find that off the side of the road? No, here's the piece of paper that was attached to the little baglet that it was in, that all the items were in. And so it happened in that year, 30 years ago, I was able to then recuperate and return back to the university, finish my studies, and go on with my life. But it is interesting and fascinating that one can really think about where we are in certain facets of our life. And it's actually quite riveting because this week, one of the days this week was celebrating doctors for their achievements. So it was National Doctors Week. And so I wanted to take a moment and thank the over 50 doctors whom I've been under their care over my lifetime. Which, of course, I still imagine myself having another 50 years of life in me to enjoy and thrive in. But I wanted to take a moment and thank them. And this is a brief naming of them, because I don't, of course, have all their names, but I wanted to take a moment and thank some of them whom I remember and have noted, and Dr. George, Dr. Parker, Dr. Black, Dr. Nickel, Dr. Silverman, Dr. Mekowitz, Dr. Barnes, Dr. Fred, Dr. Hassan, Dr. Oshida, Dr. Brung, Dr. Wallach, Dr. Simons, Dr. Marini, Dr. Northway, Dr. Adler, Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Burley, Dr. Griffin, Dr. Parker, Dr. Watson, Dr. Schaefer, Dr. Schrader, Dr. Burbank, Dr. Chang, Dr. Bruce, Dr. Smith, Dr. McKeeman, Dr. Chang, Dr. Burton, Dr. Moore, Dr. Yako, Dr. Gamble, Dr. Wood, Dr. Sun, Dr. Tuck, Dr. Christensen, Dr. Borth, Dr. Quinn, Dr. Lee, Dr. Shrimkus, Dr. Nasrallah, Dr. Wachwich, Dr. Putkin, Dr. Anvo, Dr. Halloran, Dr. Wall, Dr. Glockner, Dr. Marquardt, Dr. Smith, Dr. Sturzu, Dr. Gensauer, Dr. Mooney, Dr. Sheikh, Dr. Costanza, Dr. Palashchuk, Dr. Chung, Dr. Yang, Dr. Hekmat, Dr. Nestler, Dr. Lindberg, Dr. Costa, Dr. Christensen, Luke, Smith. That's just a short list of some of the doctors under whose care I have been under over the years of my lifetime thus far. And so I know that I am very fortunate to have had such wonderful care, such that I'm still alive. And so I appreciate that, because who doesn't want to have such fantastic health care? And of course I was thinking that I also have had fantastic nurse care and the overall health care, because we are so fortunate in this country to have nurses and healthcare providers, and I'm not even aware of half the anesthesiologists whose care I've been under. And so I'm fortunate, and I think many, many hundreds of thousands and millions of Americans also are fortunate. Gusemi, I'm thinking further, Dr. Gusemi also, his care I have been under, and so on. So I could go on, but I just wanted to appreciate that for a moment. Because after all, why wouldn't anyone appreciate that there are so many people dedicated to providing fantastic healthcare in a country that has been through so much over the years. You know, there was a study done many years ago, almost a decade ago, that we were going to need to graduate so many students from university in order to keep up scientifically to the measurement with what the world needed to be able to compete with the science, technology, engineering, and math categories. And it is important to note that we need to be able to keep students in such studies to be able to stay competitive in the world, not just in our country. Because as doctors retire, and some of the doctors that I named were already older when they were caring for me. And so I don't know how many have retired or are no longer alive. And so as much as I appreciate them for the care that they gave me, I know that some of them may not hear my message. But that doesn't take away the fact that I appreciate how fantastic they have been. over the years. And so it also means that there need to be more and more people studying for the very experience that people such as the doctors that I had were having. Having said that, insofar as Women's History Month, I wanted to make the following note, that we call it History Month, but we shouldn't leave it just as history. There are many women who are making innovations every day, and we shouldn't stop celebrating women for the fantastic accomplishments that they're making every day. And I didn't stop short in terms of pointing out gender in the appreciation of the doctors, because while some of them were men and some of them were women and some of them it doesn't matter the gender, I wanted to make note that healthcare is a very important field, and it shouldn't, when we're talking about Women's History Month, there have been so many innovations in healthcare that sometimes there is a tendency to create delineations as to what one month is for one celebration, what another month is for another celebration, and then another month is. And then all of a sudden nobody gets celebrated any other day other than the month that they were celebrated for, and everything stops. And it shouldn't really be that way after all. So I wanted us to stop and think for a moment that we shouldn't really slight anyone, we shouldn't divide anyone, and we shouldn't forget anyone. And just because someone might not get their month, might not get their day, my goodness, there's a pizza day, there's a National Pie Day, and we should really think about the fact that not everything is going to get celebrated, but we can take a moment to find recognition in and within ourselves for the very things that are important to us, without the need to have to make it a national something day. Because after all, there are only 365 days in the year. And we have to find it within ourselves not to be aggravated by the fact that if it isn't noticed on a calendar, that it isn't going to exist. So if something is very important to us, we should celebrate that. But we shouldn't become aggravated if we don't see it out there in the limelight for somebody else to celebrate for us. And that's something very important. Always let me know if you have any questions. And you do know how to get a hold of me. Thanks for listening. This is Margarita of the Dew Point Report, the Digital Electronic World Point Report. Have a great day.